Hi, everyone, and welcome to the oil section of the fossil fuel chapter. If you look at this, you'll notice how different oil's usage is from both coal and natural gas. The first thing is this transportation portion. 70% of oil usage is for transportation. Noticing how transportation really barely came up at all in our discussions of natural gas and only came or didn't come up at all in our discussions of coal. So it's kind of interesting really how much of the oil that's being used around the world is being used for transportation. Then you have the secondary factor. You have the industrial usages. We're going to do a slide that's going to talk about all the products that oil is used to make and how important that they are to your daily life. So as oil becomes more scarce, I really want you to focus on these industries that are using oil to make their products. Of course, then you also have a little commercial and a little residential. I don't know about you guys, but I do actually use oil heating for my home. I wish that I could use natural gas, but it's just not on my street yet. So my husband and I keep hoping. This is what crude oil looks like, that cup of black stuff on the left-hand side. Petroleum or crude oil is what actually gets drilled up out of the ground. So let's look at how that drilling up out of the ground actually occurs. Over here, you have a thing called source rock. Source rock is a rock that's going to undergo metamorphism. So as it gets pressed deeper into the earth and undergoes more heat and pressure, it's going to condense that rock. And when it does, the oil that is trapped inside this rock is going to squeak out. Now, you might wonder why there is water that's sitting right on top of the source rock. But remember, when we talked about oil and we talked about oil formation, hopefully you remember that in the Carboniferous period, most of the earth was covered with water, shallow seas or shallow swamps. And where oil and natural gas formed was under those shallow seas. So there's, having water on top of the source rock shouldn't be an enormous surprise. Here is your reservoir rock. This is where your oil actually resides, and it's going to migrate up through this water and end up here. On top of it, natural gas is going to form because remember that oil and natural gas form under these shallow seas in the Carboniferous period. So a lot of times you'll find both oil and gas together. Then you have a thing called cap rock. Cap rock is an impermeable rock that sits on top of the gas and the oil. And this is why the gas doesn't actually escape up into the atmosphere. On the next slide, we're going to see a drilling rig put right here, and we're going to see the drill that's put down into the oil reservoir. There are two ways that we drill. The item on the left is becoming less and less common because these are easier ways for oil to be extracted. The more common way that we're doing it in many places is by drilling in the ocean on an offshore rig like this. If you remember the BP Horizon disaster, it was on a rig very much like this one, and we're going to take a look at it in a few minutes. So again, let's go back over here. Here is that picture that I told you. It's extremely similar. If I flip back for one moment, this picture here is very, very similar to this picture here. So you can see that here's your drilling rig. And you can see that the drill comes down, it goes through the natural gas. Oftentimes the natural gas is vented so that it doesn't explode. And then down here into the oil where the oil can then be pumped up and either put into a holding container or put into an oil pipeline. Here, when they do offshore drilling, usually the oil is brought straight up and then put into a tanker, and that tanker is then brought to market. I want you to look at this picture of the world, and I really want you to focus on the darkest purple colors. So let's look at the very darkest ones. We have Venezuela here, and we have Saudi Arabia here. These are going to be the two largest sources of oil on Earth. Then we get to the next tier, okay? That's going to be Canada, Iraq and Iran, and then countries like Russia, Kuwait, UAE, those kind of countries are all on that next tier down. Take a look at the countries that have the most oil. Hopefully you notice that they're not countries that have the best relationship with the United States, with the exception, of course, of Canada. We're going to talk very specifically about Canadian oil because it's a little different from the oil that is found in many other parts of the world. We're going to watch a short socio-political issue documentary. And what I want you to get out of this, the idea is not to memorize every single socio-political issue. But what I do want you to do is as you listen to it, I want you to see how many of these countries where lots of oil is wrapped up are listed on the socio-political issues to watch in 2020. Now, remember, this socio-political documentary that you're about to watch was done at the beginning of 2020. And so this is not them using, hindsight. This is them saying, this is what we will believe will become issues in 2020. And they're really very, very accurate. If you're curious, you can actually go and watch the one for 2021, which is already up on YouTube, made by the same people. So again, when you watch through the video, I want you to think, how many of those countries, how many countries in the Middle East and other places have large oil reserves, are also in conflict?
In its annual outlook for 2020, Crisis Group sees a global system undergoing sweeping change. Rivalry among major powers is intensifying. Regional powers are at once emboldened and frightened by the emerging order. Often leaders see crises as opportunities to advance their interests or hurt their rivals. Yet, in many places, Crisis Group sees ways to calm violence and reduce human suffering. Here are 10 conflicts to watch this year. 2020 has already brought tensions between the United States and Iran to boiling point. A diplomatic breakthrough between Washington and Tehran seems unlikely, but a more modest truce to de-escalate tensions and avoid both a nuclear and regional crisis could still be achieved. In Afghanistan, more people die as a result of fighting than in any other conflict in the world. Yet the United States and the Taliban could still make a deal that sets the stage for peace talks among Afghans. Recent talks between Saudi Arabia and Houthi rebels provide a window for peace in Yemen and relief for the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But that window could close soon, especially if heightening US-Iran tensions spill into Yemen. Ethiopia's transition under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed remains a source of hope. But as ethnic strife surges, some warn that the country could fracture, as Yugoslavia did in the 1990s, with disastrous consequences for an already troubled region. Burkina Faso is the latest country in Africa's Sahel region to fall victim to Islamist militancy. Violence has spread across many rural areas and risks spilling south to countries on the Gulf of Guinea. Foreign powers have upped their involvement in Libya, making attempts to reach a peace deal more difficult. The result is likely to be either a destructive stalemate or a takeover of the capital Tripoli that prolongs militia fighting. Prospects for diplomacy seem to be dimming after North Korea lifted its moratoria on nuclear and long-range missile testing at the end of 2019. Yet both parties stand to lose from a return to the hostile rhetoric and actions of 2017. 2019 saw a dangerous flare-up over disputed Kashmir between nuclear-armed India and Pakistan as New Delhi revoked the region's semi-autonomous status. The gravest danger in 2020 is that a militant attack triggers a new escalation. In Venezuela, President Maduro's government has weathered a civil-military uprising, a regional boycott, and US sanctions. But it remains isolated, and 7 million Venezuelans need humanitarian aid. The government's seizure of the opposition-controlled parliament in early 2020 puts resolution of the crisis further out of reach. Last, a new president in Ukraine has brought fresh energy to ending the 6-year-old conflict with Russian-backed separatists in the east. But plenty could go wrong if the current ceasefire collapses and fighting escalates. These are Crisis Group's top 10 conflicts to watch in the year ahead. We will be...
Okay, hopefully you saw through there. You saw Iran, you saw Libya, you saw Venezuela, you saw Russia, all of these countries that we looked at as having so much stake in the oil market. Now, there are two types of, I guess, unusual or non-traditional oil sources. They're going to be called tar oil or oil sands. They're also, the second one that we're going to look at is going to be called shale oil. And basically, they're both mined. So one of the reasons that we look at this is because take a look at the country that has this source. Look at that Canada section. So one of our closest neighbors and closest allies, Canada, has a lot of these alternative oil products domestically. So does the United States, which we'll see in a moment. But the problem is that they contain 20% more CO2 than traditional petroleum or traditional crude oil. The actual substance that gets distilled out is called bitumen, and it is a semi-solid black oil-like substance that can be distilled and refined into a petroleum-like product. Here is a picture of that mining. You can see the actual physical rock down here. You can also see that sometimes it comes in a sandier version, but both of these things are going to need to be further refined before they are able to be used in commercial processes. Shale oil. This is very similar to the type of rock in which you would find natural gas, because remember, these two items form very similar, or in very similar circumstances. This shale oil is called kerogen, and it has very much the same issues that the other one does. Firstly, it needs to be mined. So it's difficult to extract the oil. Once it is mined, it then needs to be heated up to evaporate the kerogen. It then needs to be condensed. It then needs to be refined, and then it can be put out into the market. But of course, because you have to do all of these items up here, it makes this oil more expensive. It also has more impurities, but look at the benefit. It's in Canada, Utah, and Wyoming. So this is a domestic source of oil for the United States. Here is a picture of it. You can see the rock, and you can see the kerogen that can be gotten from the rock. It looks very, very similar to crude oil. So how are tar sands and oil shale different from crude oil? Number one, they're semi-solids. They're not liquids. We don't drill for them, we mine for them. They also release more CO2 and other pollutants when combusted. Now, the thing is, what do we actually make from oil? This is a distillation chart. Essentially, crude oil goes in like this. It's then heated. Depending on what heat it is heated to, depends on the product. This is going to be the coolest. This is going to be the hottest. And so the oil will actually vaporize. When it vaporizes to a certain point and the heat is cut off, it will then condense into that product. So it can condense into things like bitumen for roads and roofing, fuel for ships, factories, and heating, lubricants, oils, waxes, polishes, diesel fuel, jet fuel, petrol for your car, all kinds of chemicals, as well as petroleum gas. So there are so many products. Let's take a look at some other products. The one that I really want to talk about the most, and I'm sorry that this got cut off, is the fact that you have a lot of these physical products that are being created, as well as tons and tons of medical products that literally cannot be created using anything except petrochemicals. So when we think about oil, and we think about the future of oil, we also want to think about the fact that things like the case on your cell phone are not able to be created without oil. There is a group called OPEC. And OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. We're going to watch a little video on them in a moment. I'll let this wonderful British man explain OPEC to you, but these are the countries that are part of OPEC. The top three are Iran, Iraq, in Saudi Arabia.
Oil isn't just petrol for your car, it's an ingredient in a lot of what we use, from the plastic glove that keeps your hand clean to the tyres that keep you on the road, which means these products can be affected by the fluctuating price of oil. That price is largely decided by supply and demand and the collective actions of an organisation that provides 40% of the world's oil, OPEC. OPEC stands for the Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. It was formed in 1960 by founding members Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. The group was created to monitor the stability and prices of the petroleum market, which was previously determined by US-dominated multinational oil companies. Currently, OPEC member countries also include Algeria, Angola, Ecuador, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Today, these oil-producing member countries supply over 40% of the world's crude oil production, and together they control more than 80% of the world's proven crude oil reserves. OPEC's oil and energy ministers meet twice a year in Vienna, Austria, where they collectively decide whether to raise or lower oil output in order to maintain a stable market. Critics argue that it's a way for them to maintain the price they want. But does OPEC actually control world oil? The biggest consumers of oil are the US and China. It was China's rapid development in the early 2000s, coupled with a lack of growth in the production of oil, which sent the price of oil shooting up. In turn, those high prices made it profitable for non-OPEC countries like the US and Canada to go after and discover harder to extract oil. Because they weren't bound by the cartel's decisions, these countries have grown their levels of supply, which meant OPEC's market influence began to decline. A rise in supply and a reduced demand for oil in Europe and Asia led to the price of oil crashing. This caused political problems in some OPEC countries like Venezuela, where oil is the chief driver of the economy. It has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, but also the highest inflation rate on the planet. But for most consumers, the drop in the price of oil has meant cheaper fuel and lower energy costs. Since 2016, however, oil prices have been steadily rising. Later that year, the Saudi-led OPEC members agreed to the first production cut since 2008, a reduction of around 1 million barrels a day. Crucially, Russia and 10 other non-members also agreed to pump less oil. OPEC and its allies agreed to extend the cuts through to the end of 2018. But in the US, there's a shale oil boom. Production levels recently hit a record high and are predicted to surpass both Saudi Arabia and Russia. But even with higher output levels, the US still imports roughly 300 million barrels of oil a month. For the renewable energy industry, however, keeping oil supply high and steady makes it an attractive alternative and might be one of the most powerful tools to grow the sector. But the price of oil remains volatile. Geopolitical factors such as the Iran nuclear deal and President Trump threatening OPEC could see the prices go up or down. But in the end, the forces of supply and demand will ultimately determine the price. With more than 80% of the world's proven oil reserves, OPEC in the 21st century continues to be relevant, and their decisions can still affect the price of oil, if just temporarily. But as new sources of energy gradually replace hydrocarbons, the oil industry faces a race against time. In the words of an ex-Saudi oil minister, the Stone Age did not end for lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil.
So there you go. There is an explanation of OPEC and their position in the world, as well as how the United States is sort of managing OPEC's previous dominance by dealing with more domestic sources of oil. So why is oil important? It accounts for 1/3 of the Earth's energy supply. It powers 99% of all transportation. This is cars and trains and buses and trucks. And that there's just a tremendous amount of infrastructure that goes into moving oil around. It also generates huge revenue. And so for places like Venezuela, it's the vast majority of their GDP, or gross domestic product. Pipelines. There's obvious negatives. Look at the pipeline that's in the bottom left hand there. That's one of my photographs from my trip. Do you notice how it's in the middle of nowhere. No one is standing there. No one is watching that. And so one of the fears that's always around is, will there ever be domestic or foreign terrorism that will focus on hitting oil pipelines like this? Also, you can have, and they can just rupture, leak, or be damaged for many reasons, and the cleanup is really difficult. It's made even worse if it happens over water. And so in a little bit, we're going to watch a bit about the BP Horizon explosion that happened in the Gulf of Mexico. So in a minute, you're going to watch this Keystone XL Pipeline video. This is what you should learn from it. Where would the pipeline connect? What type of oil reserve is the pipeline getting its oil from? List 3 concerns for the pipeline and list some pros of the pipeline. The answers to these are in the notes section. So after you've watched the video, if you don't know what the answers are, you're welcome to pull up the PowerPoint and take a look at the answer section.
This episode is brought to you by AJ Plus. The U.S. Senate recently approved the construction of the Keystone XL Pipeline. It was good news for big oil companies and TransCanada, who will manage the pipeline's construction. But the controversial decision has sparked mass demonstrations urging President Obama to veto the project. So what is the Keystone XL Pipeline? The construction of the pipeline will complete the final phase of a 3,800-mile network known as the Keystone Pipeline System. An existing pipeline, which was completed in June of 2010, has the capacity of carrying 590,000 barrels of oil per day from the Canadian tar sands to U.S. refineries in Illinois and Texas. The new, larger Keystone XL pipeline would be capable of carrying 830,000 barrels of oil per day. Advocates of the project say that the increased production will inject $2 billion worth of economic benefits into the U.S., but activists argue it will only worsen the social and environmental impacts that the existing pipeline has created. So what's behind these arguments? For one, the tar sands are not a conventional source of petroleum. Tar sands are actually a composition of sand, clay, water, and bitumen. Because of its impurity, bitumen within the tar sands has to go through an energy-intensive chemical process of extraction and refinement, which could pollute waterways and create toxic waste. There is also a problem with where the tar sands are located. Around 1/3 of the world's tar sand deposits lie beneath the boreal forests of Alberta, one of the world's largest intact forest ecosystems. However, this wilderness faces an uncertain future. According to an activist group, oil companies have already leased more than half of the land. Aside from the environmental problems, the Keystone XL is also under fire for its impact on society. The pipeline will run through the sovereign lands of several indigenous tribes, and according to human rights groups, thousands of people have already been displaced. But proponents of the pipeline argue that the U.S. should be looking at the bigger picture. According to a 2011 TransCanada assessment, the Keystone XL's construction and eventual operation will help create 140,000 jobs. However, the U.S. State Department has since suggested that this figure would be more like 42,000. In addition to job creation, supporters also say that the pipeline would give the U.S. greater oil independence and boost the economy. So if the Senate has already approved the Keystone XL, why is there still so much controversy? Well, TransCanada can't actually begin construction until they receive a presidential permit, and that's because the pipeline crosses an international border. Ultimately, the decision comes down to President Obama. To learn more about why the Keystone Pipeline is so controversial, check out this animation from our friends.
I just want to let you know that the Keystone XL pipeline did not actually go through. President Obama did not give the okay, and President Trump has since not addressed it. So it doesn't exist. So then why did I present this? Because you want to know how much piping there is out there, and the fact that as traditional oil sources become scarcer, things like this are going to go back on the table. And it's just valuable to know, what were we doing in the past and what will this potentially look like in the future? Now we want to look at the really big negatives. This is actually from a Hollywood video that dealt with the BP Horizon Blowout. And they do an incredibly nice job. Okay, a little cinematic, but a really nice job trying to get at what was it actually like on this rig when this explosion happened, and then why was it so? Thus, when you see this, you'll understand why it was so incredibly difficult to mitigate the negatives once the oil is in the water, I mean. So that's obviously a floating drilling platform. And we're going to be looking at the wellhead, which is far underwater.
Jason, are you seeing this? Shit. We got flow out here. Hey, Jason, are you seeing this? Holy shit!
Now remember, did you see that little bit of vapor? Think to yourself, what is sitting right on top of the oil in the rigs? Or I'm sorry, underground. What's sitting right underneath that cap rock? Hopefully you thought to yourself it's natural gas. So needless to say, you can probably guess what's about to happen next. So that pretty much ends the section where the rig actually blows out and explodes. And I wanted to show you some photographs sort of what ended up happening to the wildlife all along the coast. So this oil will just sit on top of the water, and it adheres to anything. It adheres to land, to beaches, to animals. And even worse is that it will actually sink down, because as the oil gets tossed around, it will actually become more dense than water, and it will actually sink down and lie on top of the seabed. If you know anything about the industries in this area, in Louisiana, they do a lot of mussel, oyster, crops like that. So they basically made them toxic for very, very long periods of time. So does oil spill damage last forever? The answer is it's tough. These things called tar balls form. These are things that end up becoming dense and falling down. They lie on top of the sea floor. Sea animals die not only from getting touched and stuck by the oil, but all the fumes that, all the natural gas and things like that, and then the poisons that are coming off the oil itself, because it's unrefined. All of the coral and things like that are also severely damaged. Some populations are just not capable of recovering. So here is our last video, and it is on oil spill damage. And then we'll just take a look at a piece, or a map of the Keystone XL Pipeline, even though it was not put in, just so you can get an idea about where a potential future pipelines might go in.
Have you ever tried to remove a liquid from another liquid? It's not really that easy. There's a reason that they say oil and water don't mix, and it's not just because they literally don't mix. Hey everyone, thank you for watching D-News Today. I'm Trace. Oil is a mainstay for modern post-industrial revolution society. We run our engines and heat and power our homes with it. And even with all the precautions and cost involved, sometimes we accidentally spill it everywhere. Most recently in Refugio State Beach on the central coast of California on May 19th, but also in Yellowstone National Park in Montana, in the Black Sea, Israel, Louisiana, Indiana, Curacao, and in North Dakota thrice. And that's just in the last year and a half. Cleaning up the spill is heavily studied. But what happens later? What happens 5, 10, 50 years after an oil spill? Is everything just hunky-dory? Not at all. On March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker ran aground, spilling more than 11 million gallons of crude oil into waters off the coast of Alaska. At the time, it was the largest oil spill in U.S. history. More than 1,000 miles of shoreline were covered in the toxic hydrocarbon chemical, and more than 2,000 sea otters, 300 harbor seals, and 250,000 seabirds died following the spill. The Exxon Valdez was a huge story when I was a kid, and by volume it was only eclipsed by the April 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill by BP. These two spills are affecting flora and fauna in massive numbers, but now years later, what's happening? Even after cleanup is considered done, oil is still in the environment. For example, tar balls wash up onshore months or years later. Tar balls are crusty, weathered balls filled with a soft, gooey oil, like a toasted marshmallow of death. When I think of an oil spill, I picture water with a thin layer of oil on top, spreading for miles, which is the first stage of the spill. Eventually, the sun, wind, waves, ocean bacteria, and other forces act on that oil, creating tar balls. The sun helps evaporate the lighter components, leaving behind the heavy chemical compounds. Sand and tiny particles in the ocean water collect into the oil, and the sun, waves, and wind form the oil into an emulsion. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, says it looks like chocolate pudding and is even stickier than the original spilled oil. If it comes in contact with the beach or a rock, it can crack open again, causing new tiny oil spills. Some cleanups are so severe, the topmost layer of sand is completely removed on a beach and new uncontaminated sand is brought in. Scientific American wrote in 2003 that bacterial growth is inhibited on beaches, and in Alaska, toxicity remained for a decade or more. Mammals and ducks will eat prey that are contaminated with oil. Mussel beds are still recovering in Alaska. An estimated time for that? 30 years. According to the National Wildlife Foundation, turtles and dolphins are still being affected by oil in the Gulf, with turtles stranding themselves at 5 times the normal rate, and a new study in PLOS One finding adrenal and lung lesions in Gulf dolphins because of the inhalation of oil fumes when they come up for air. Under the water, life is also hit hard whenever oil spills. But humans are quick to forget and move on because, we don't live down there. Coral in the Gulf were covered in oil, and dead and dying coral were found 7 miles from the BP spill site. A study published in Science after the Exxon Valdez spill found even a few molecules of oil out of every billion, known as parts per billion, was enough to harm some animals like salmon, whose mortality rates increased for years after the spill because sensitive fish eggs were contacted by tiny amounts of toxic crude oil. Oil is toxic. Inhalation or ingestion of and contact with hydrocarbons can be really bad for humans and animals. But the decades of cleanup and response can affect the ecosystem in so many ways. Even the propellers of boats can disturb and kill wildlife. Today, 26 years later, oil is still found on the beaches of Alaska, and although some species have returned to pre-spill levels, some species of fish, whale, and bird are not recovering at all. More recently, NOAA created a model of how sea currents likely carried the BP Deepwater Horizon oil along the Gulf Coast past Florida into the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Though years go by and the media move on, spills like these go on to affect waterways for generations to come. So when spills like these do happen, who pays for all the cleanup? Luckily, Test Tube's crack research team explored that exact thing right here.
So here is, again, another picture of the Keystone XL pipeline. Again, did not end up happening, but if you notice, there already is a pipeline that is bringing much of the material from Canada down to, to Nebraska, and then down into Oklahoma. So even though the full XL pipeline did not get created, there is still a way to move oil around from these, really stunning forest areas in Canada down to places where they can be more easily shipped. So here are our advantages and disadvantages. I'm just going to leave that up there. They're pretty self-explanatory. And this is the end. Please remember that we are not going to do the natural disasters on the test, so we'll cover those separately.